let's talk about the movement of the lids. What's important to capture carefully here is how the lids travel across the sclera. Usually these are interpreted way too conveniently by most beginners. We've all seen these semi-ovals that is often used to represent the eye. This won't do for what we are after, however, and so we must take a slightly different approach that hopefully gets us closer to representing something that looks and feels real. The upper lid can be broken down into 4 straight lines. These lines are going to have different lengths to them depending on the person and where the person's gaze is directed. The lower lid can usually be broken down into 3 straight lines, and the same thing applies for the lower lid as does for the upper lid. It will appear differently depending on the person and the direction of the person's gaze. This means that we must observe carefully when doing this kind of work, as there are many factors that will determine the outcome. We will also want to look for an offset in the high point and low point in the upper and lower lid, which creates a very interesting look that's dynamic. More often than not, you'll find this feature if you look for it carefully. There is something to be said for looking for something and then finding it. I try not to look for things that will get in the way, meaning that they won't work well with what I expect to see in nature. So let's say I wanted to break the upper lid down into straight lines and I decided to use 2 lines. This wouldn't really work well with what I'm seeing usually, and therefore it would be going against what we have in front of us in terms of models. But if we expect things that are more likely to appear or work better when observing from nature, then we are putting ourselves in a better spot where we are more prepared for what is to come. There is always an inherent danger in sort of knowing what is to come before it comes, especially considering that nature often throws curveballs at us in its almost infinite variety. So be prepared for that variety to show up, but having some expectations for what you'll see usually means seeing more quicker. The argument is sometimes made that knowing anatomy makes you only see anatomy and not the variety present in the model's anatomy, for example. You only see the very schematic figure that you've seen in your anatomy class. And I don't really think this is true, and as long as you're aware and try not to fit something somewhere it doesn't, you should be fine. More knowledge is always going to lend itself to better final results. The more we continue to add to our portrait, the more it changes before our eyes. We begin to see more and notice more. When we get the eyes in, we get a much clearer picture of everything that surrounds the eyes, and usually there is need for tweaking. Especially in the eye sockets, there tends to be things to change. Usually I'll need to push the bottom of the eye sockets up because I've left it a touch too low as a precaution. We've spoken about that in previous videos. Leaving it too low gives me a bit more space to fit the planes of the lower lids, but once these are placed, I have to adjust the bottom edge of the eye socket to fit. The same thing goes for the amount of flesh that sits between the upper edge of the eye socket and the upper lid. I'll usually have too little clay here because it means I have slightly more access to the eyelids when I begin sculpting them. Once the lids are getting there and appear somewhat decent, I can begin to close down the eye socket slightly and start approaching the appearance that I'm after. This is pretty typical. The more the portrait approaches its final state, the more issues are revealed to us. Ideally, the issues that are revealed to us are small enough to be manageable at the point the sculpture is in the process. This is why I take a lot of time, because I'd like the chance to improve the work in its current state always, whatever that might be. So much so that there's nothing left for me to do, ideally. When I run out of things to do, I move forwards with, for example, adding the eyelids. But I only do so once the sockets are really, really good. And once the eyelids are added, I have more context up there, and everything then comes up for debate again. Changes then have to occur, almost everywhere. If these changes are small enough, however, then they will be manageable and I won't get myself into trouble. But if the changes that needs to happen are really large and difficult to do, then I'm in trouble. Usually I can avoid this by being really diligent at every step in the process and sort of cleaning up after myself constantly. Consider it like in cooking, making sure that you finish one task before moving on to the next. Do some dishes underway so you don't have to clean up a lot at the end. Cut all your vegetables at the beginning, not while you're trying to cook the meat. All these sorts of things that essentially will help you stay on top of the situation and do as much work and answer as many questions as you can possibly manage at the point that you're at in the process currently. Then, when you move forwards, things will ideally fall into place a little bit easier and there will be less back and forth. And we all know that back and forth in sculpture is one of the most frustrating things we can get into. I'm making a pretty silly mistake here, which is also rather typical. I'm making the eyes a little bit too big. But unfortunately, this can be hard to spot without the context of the sclera sometimes, or the white of the eye. The sclera is just the white of the eye. So since I have only lids there, things can be sometimes tough to see, which is a bit of a downside to working like I am here. So while it's very flexible and easy to adjust and change, it can be easy to miss things because we are missing some important parts of the context that makes up the feature of the eye. It's very difficult in the beginning, especially, to wrap your head around this way of working. It's very typical to make the features too large, since most of us think of the face as being made up of mouth, nose, and eyes. And this is true, of course, but there's a lot more to it, and very often the things we don't have names for or don't know the names of tend to be forgotten or dealt with less care than they should. A typical one that students will often miss out on is this little movement in the contour from the profile view which connects the nose to the mouth. And without this little movement in the contour, we get this really awkward looking face which appears to have the features sort of pasted on, and they're not naturally growing or attached to the face. The down-facing plane of the brow ridge, or the glabella, is also often forgotten or dealt with really poorly. This part of the face even has a name, and most of it know it once we start sculpting, or at least once we've sculpted a little bit. But most regular folks are not going to know about the glabella or the name of the glabella, and therefore it's often forgotten about. In addition to making the eyes too big here, I'm making eyes that are not quite as symmetrical as I'd like either. Both are things that I should have caught, of course, but we'll deal with both of those issues a little bit further into the video, and I'll show you how to solve silly mistakes like this one. At this stage of the process, I'm beginning to consider shape design. In sculpture, shape design just means the shape of a form that you can see on the surface. All the surface forms have specific shapes to them, and you can tweak these to fit them together nicely, or sometimes they end up fitting together rather awkwardly as well. Poor shape design can happen if we don't pay attention to it. There are very few good rules for good design, because good design can be so many different things. There are, however, some really nice rules that we can use for bad shape design. Some of the things to know about is that shapes should fit together like a puzzle. They should be more complex than squares, triangles, and circles, for example. Never use circles. And we should avoid awkward tangents and shapes that are really long and narrow and sort of wedge their way like a spear tip in between other shapes. And if we can follow some of these rules, we're not guaranteed success, but they can be really helpful, and at least we're guaranteed not having terribly shitty shape design. So just to show you an example, notice that I'm working towards a decent shape in the shapes below the lower eyelid at the moment. I offset the low point and push it towards one side, the outside, so that the shape is not too convenient and simple, it's not symmetrical. I also try my best to make sure the outline of the shape is interesting and not simply a triangle or an oval. These shapes could easily become something really boring by making them either ovals with the low point dead center of the shape, or perhaps by making them into more triangular shapes with less angle breaks than what we have here. Certain shapes demand a certain design aesthetic. Ultimately, the shape that you design for anything should do a good job at communicating to the viewer what that shape is. So a nose must look like a nose, it can't be designed willy-nilly and only thought of as, you can't only attempt to make it good shape design, you have to actually make it look like a nose as well. But within these parameters and following these rules, there are plenty of designing to be done. And shape design is one of those things that are going to be an eventual part of your style. So consider it on a conscious level. Don't let it become random. Consider shape design.